Right at the very beginning, I talked to you about the great resistance that many Indians have about free markets and about trade and commerce in general. This was further compounded, besides the colonial experience, by the fact that when we got our independence, that was the height of Fabian thinking, of utopian thinking, that governments could solve all problems. And our founding fathers were influenced by that as much as our history of suspicion of foreign trade. Now, in the 20 years that we have opened up, of course, our share of foreign trade, our share of the world's income is again rising, after having fallen dramatically from 1700 till the late 19th century, late 20th century, and now it's rising again. Now, I like to give examples of how markets have dramatically changed, not the economy, but society. Markets obviously have dramatically changed the economy. So, I like to give the example of the telecom revolution. So in 90 years since Graham Bell invented the telephone, India, first during the British Raj and then during independent India, added up only about, I don't know, it was between 5 and 10 million connections. And in 15 years since then, we've added about 900 million connections. Even if you do deduplication, if you take out if you only count unique new telephone connections, cell phone connections, you're still talking in excess of 600 million connections. So this is a dramatic change. Now we all know what that's done to communications, we all know what that's done to the markets, but the point I like to emphasize is we have a generation of Indians today, a couple of 100 million strong at least, who have grown up never having to pay a bribe to get a telephone connection. Now when Parth and I were growing up, it was unthinkable that you could get a phone connection without bribing someone. It was a limited commodity, it was sanctioned by Delhi, and in great short supply. And we thought it was absolutely, it was just unthinkable. I mean, you could apply and wait for 35 years to get a connection. But you have hundreds of millions of young Indians who think it's abnormal. And they think it's abnormal to wait for years to buy a motorcycle or a car, which was the norm. We have these young Indians think it is abnormal to pay the routine day-to-day bribes, which was a fact of life, which still remains a fact of life in many areas in India. And that is a huge societal change that is taking place. That is one of the reasons that corruption is not going to be tolerated anymore, and you're beginning to see the action against that. Unfortunately, the opposite argument can also be made using exactly the same industry sector. Telecom is one sector where you have seen huge cronyism. And the problem that we have had in sustaining smoothly the changeover to market-based policies is that we have not always implemented them properly. We have created a great number of crony capitalists, and that leads to a renewed suspicion that markets are good. I mean a renewed suspicion that markets are bad. We have seen cronyism not just in the telecom sector. If you look at Indian newspapers and magazines over the last few years, you'll see cronyism in quite a large number of sectors. Now, what is hard for the media to explain, and what is hard for politicians to explain, that sometimes this is a natural fallout. And I gave the example of what happened in America between 150 and 100 years ago. You got a lot of robber barons who made a lot of wealth because of cornering certain markets, because of their political connections, and you're beginning to see a lot of that in India. Now, in the US, you had changes, and in India, you're beginning to see some of those changes. But when you see, the world today is a very different world than 120 years ago. With the prevalence of media, with 700 and more satellite television channels accessible all over India, with internet at 120 million subscribers in India and growing rapidly, it is not possible to expect people to be patient and wait for changes to take place. So that is not easily done. Now, the impatience that the public has means that politicians have to react faster. And it's taken us about 3 years to react, which I submit to you is actually quite a lot faster than would have been the case in the 60s or the 70s. So the system is beginning to change. It is beginning to react because politicians are clearly seeing that if you are not part of the solution, then you're being perceived as only part of the problem, and there is going to be a huge pushback from voters on that ground. The suspicion of markets in India runs wide and deep, because if you go down to the village level, you see contractors working to build roads, to build little bridges, to build so many other things, and what the average Indian experiences is that these are all cronies. The businesses that are handed out by government have not been in the past handed out with the greatest transparency. So right down to the village level, a lot of people equate free markets with cronyism. And unless that changes, the ability of the system to harness the forces of markets is going to be very different. Now, it is changing. I don't want to give you the impression that there is so much suspicion of the markets that things are not changing. That's not true. It is changing. Things are changing. A lot of people realize today that competition is coming in, and that is helping. Again, the telephone example, in the past, you used to have one monopoly, government-owned entity that gave you telephone connections. Today, you don't have to run after that entity. There are a dozen entities that run after you, and they run after you because they have competition. And the same thing happens when a rural person has enough money to buy a bicycle today, or enough money to buy a scooter, or enough money to buy a few other things. But we are in a state of flux, where a lot of what a rural Indian experiences in the economy is still influenced, if not controlled, by the government, and still not transparent enough to give her or him the comfort that this is a truly competitive process. They still think of a lot of businessmen as cronies. And unfortunately, there's been reason enough to do that. Now, we had a period, we had a decade or so, when we started lionizing certain business leaders. We had a period when the IT industry took off in such a way, and it was not perceived to be based on cronyism. And although the IT industry remains a rather small employer in the country with maybe 2.5 million employees, it has been at the forefront of reviving Indians' opinion about India. The India that Parth and I grew up in was a very diffident India. We still had that old carryover that we couldn't compete in free global markets. That's why we had to clamp down on our economy, on our borders, have very high tariffs. That has changed, and that change was led by the global success of the IT industry. And it led to entrepreneurs in telecom and other sectors who a decade ago were being lionized as the new India. And they still exist, but because of the backlash that has happened with a new rash of cronyism, and this backlash is also helped by the global developments which I talked about earlier, that this backlash is not just in India. You know, the same countries that used to lecture us on the virtues of free markets, the same countries that used to tell us that we need to have open borders for trade and competition and globalization, are the countries that have today turned around, and they're worried about outsourcing, they're worried about their jobs growth at home. So this is both a domestic phenomenon as well as an international phenomenon. I submit to you that the problems that we are facing today are not permanent, and they are changing. And they are changing for the better. We have a need to utilize market forces. Let me give you the example of schools. Now, we have, in the last 10 years, dramatically increased our expenditure on schools. So, government schools used to have relatively shabby infrastructure, but a very large number of government schools, the majority of them today, have decent infrastructure. They have good rooms, they have well-paid teachers, in fact, very highly paid teachers, and yet they turn out terrible results. We spend enormous amounts of money on things like midday meal schemes to incentivize poor parents to keep their children in schools rather than use them as another pair of hands in the fields. And that succeeds to a great extent. But what succeeds much better, and this is what is ironic, is throughout the country, both in urban as well as in rural settings, you have private schools that are doing much better. And lest you think that I'm talking about elitist private schools, I'm not. Of course, the elitist private schools have always existed and they do well. They cater to the middle class and the upper classes. They've always done well. But I'm talking about schools in slums. I'm talking about schools in remote villages that are run by NGOs, that are run by missionaries. They charge a fraction, they pay a fraction of the salary to their teachers that government teachers get. They often have very ramshackle infrastructure, just in fairly terrible shape compared to the government school often across the street, and yet they turn out dramatically better results. This is where parents are sending their children increasingly. And what we need to do is recognize that there are market forces that we need to harness. One of the missions I have is to keep convincing my constituents and others that while the government has a responsibility to ensure that every child is educated, we ought not to expect that the government should do it directly itself. And that it's not a good thing, because government is not good at running businesses, it's not good at running certain organizations. I think we should hold the government accountable for its obligation to have every child educated, but find the most efficient and the most successful means of doing so. So ideas such as school vouchers haven't yet caught on, but fortunately, another idea which is catching on today is the idea of cash transfers. And that is simply because of the resistance to corruption. It has been estimated that in certain sectors, only 27% of the government expenditure reaches the beneficiary citizen. 73% goes away either in administrative costs or in leakage and corruption. And the resistance to that is what is bringing about this attempt at cash transfers based on biometrics, still at a very initial stage, but I believe it will be a revolution in the coming years. So in conclusion, I just want to cite one example, and it's not an Indian example. Last week's issue of The Economist has a very intriguing article, and I think the headline is called the new Nordic superstars. The idea is that these 4 or 5 Nordic countries, which were known to be extremely left of center 3 decades ago, and even today, when right-wing politicians in Europe and America often talk about the dangers of too much statism, they refer to the Swedish model of the 70s. And the Economist article is very eye-opening about how these countries have dramatically changed. They still have, they don't have those 80-100% rates of taxation anymore. They've come down dramatically. But they still have the social obligations which many other countries have not yet taken on, but they are implementing their social obligations, not directly, but through outsourcing and through market-based mechanisms, which are turning out to be much more efficient. And I believe for at least the next couple of decades, that is going to be the way forward. Thank you.